Dear listener, settle yourself now into comfort. Let your breathing slow, your body soften into the embrace of wherever you rest. Tonight, we journey together into a story woven from magic and memory, from the mist-laden highlands of Scotland to the ancient corridors of Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry. This is a tale of a life lived with extraordinary grace, a life of steel wrapped in velvet, of fierce loyalty tempered by profound compassion. We speak tonight of Professor Minerva McGonagall, whose very name carries the weight of wisdom, the ring of authority, and yet, beneath it all, the softest purr of understanding. She was a woman who could transform not only into the sleek tabby cat that prowled the castle grounds, but into whatever her students needed. Stern disciplinarian, protective guardian, inspiring teacher, or the quiet presence that said, without words, "You are safe here. Let the cares of your day drift away now, like owl feathers floating on evening air." As you listen, allow yourself to be transported to a world where magic is as real as breath, where portraits whisper in gilded frames, where staircases shift and candles float in midair. In this world, we will trace the footsteps of a remarkable witch, from her first breath in the Scottish Highlands to her final legacy, etched in the very stones of Hogwarts itself. Close your eyes, dear listener. Let us begin where all stories must, at the very beginning, in a small corner of Scotland, where the wind carries secrets and the land remembers magic. The year was 1935, and October had painted the Scottish Highlands in shades of copper and gold. The heather-clad hills rolled endlessly beneath vast skies, and in the small village of Caithness, where the North Sea crashes against ancient cliffs with tireless devotion, a child was born who would change the course of wizarding history. Though the world beyond Britain teetered on the edge of darkness, and those shadows gathered in places both magical and mundane, on the 4th day of October, in a modest Presbyterian manse, Minerva McGonagall drew her first breath. The house itself was unremarkable to Muggle eyes, a sturdy stone structure built to withstand the harsh northern winds, with a slate roof and small windows that glowed warm with lamplight on cold evenings. Ivy climbed the eastern wall, and a small garden, carefully tended despite the challenging soil, produced herbs and vegetables through the short growing season. It was the home of Reverend Robert McGonagall, a man of unwavering faith and gentle temperament, respected throughout the village for his thoughtful sermons and his willingness to help any soul in need. But this house held secrets that the good Reverend himself did not yet fully understand. For his wife, Isabel, was not merely the minister's wife, the woman who arranged flowers for the kirk and visited the sick. Isabel McGonagall, born Isabel Ross, carried magic in her very bones, a witch of considerable talent who had made the most painful choice a magical person can make, to hide her true nature from the man she loved. Let us linger here a moment, dear listener, in understanding this sacrifice. Imagine possessing the ability to transform the world around you with a whisper and a wand, to brew potions that could heal or harm, to read the stars and understand the language of magical creatures. Now imagine locking all of that away, binding it deep within yourself, living as though you were ordinary when you were anything but. This was Isabel's daily existence, and the weight of it shaped the very air that young Minerva breathed from her first moments. The Ross family had been magical for generations, their lineage traceable back through the mists of Scottish history, to a time when the distinction between witch and wise woman was barely perceptible. They had been healers and seers, scholars and protectors of ancient knowledge. Isabel's own mother had been particularly gifted in Transfiguration, that most elegant and demanding of magical arts, and it was said that her grandmother could speak to the ravens that nested in the crags above Loch Ness, understanding their croaking prophecies as clearly as human speech. But Isabel had fallen in love with Robert McGonagall during her youth, before she attended Hogwarts. In those tender years, when the heart makes choices that the head cannot yet comprehend. He was handsome in a quiet way, with kind eyes and a beautiful singing voice that filled the small kirk with unexpected joy. He was everything good and honest, and Isabel loved him with a fierceness that surprised even herself. When her Hogwarts letter arrived, her parents, understanding but sorrowful, had allowed her to make her own choice. She went to Hogwarts, yes, and excelled there, particularly in Transfiguration and charms. But every holiday, she returned to Caithness, to the Muggle boy who wrote her letters about his theological studies and his dreams of serving his community. The international statute of secrecy weighed heavily on Isabel. To marry Robert, she would have to tell him the truth, and in telling him, she would burden him with knowledge that might destroy the very foundation of his faith and understanding of the world. Or she could hide her magic forever, could pretend to be something she was not. In the end, love won, but at a cost that would echo through generations. She married Robert without telling him her secret, and she put her wand away in a locked trunk in the attic, alongside her Hogwarts robes and the textbooks that had once been her most precious possessions. For years, she succeeded in this deception, though it hollowed her out in ways that never quite healed. She channeled her magical energy into the ordinary tasks of daily life, scrubbing floors with an intensity that seemed almost supernatural, kneading bread with such focus that the loaves rose impossibly high and light. Robert noticed his wife's occasional strangeness, the way she sometimes seemed to know things before they happened, the way sick parishioners who visited their home seemed to recover more quickly than expected, the way her garden flourished even in the poorest weather. But he attributed these things to his wife's good sense, her natural gifts, her capable hands. And then Minerva was born, and everything changed. The moment Isabel held her daughter for the first time, she felt it, the unmistakable pulse of magic, stronger than her own had been at birth, thrumming through the tiny body wrapped in soft wool blankets. The baby's eyes, even clouded with newness, seemed to look at her mother with unusual focus, and when she grasped Isabel's finger, a small spark, barely visible but definitely there, passed between them. Isabel's heart filled with joy and terror in equal measure. Her daughter was magical, powerfully so, and the secret she had kept would not remain buried. Young Minerva grew quickly, a serious child with dark hair and eyes that observed everything with penetrating intelligence. Even as an infant, she rarely cried, instead watching the world around her with quiet intensity. The neighbors remarked on what a good baby she was, how alert, how strangely calm. But Isabel saw what they could not, the way shadows sometimes moved when Minerva looked at them, the way her rattle would float inches above her crib when she was meant to be sleeping, the way she seemed to understand conversations far beyond her years. The McGonagall household stood at the edge of the village, where the tamed gardens gave way to wild moors. Beyond their back gate, the land stretched open and free, dotted with standing stones older than memory. On clear days, you could see for miles the silver ribbon of a distant stream, the darker patches where peat bogs waited to trap the unwary, the stone walls that marked ancient boundaries. This was a landscape that remembered magic, even if the people who now walked it had mostly forgotten. Minerva's earliest memories, formed in those years before words could properly capture experience, were of wind and space, and a kind of freedom that she would later understand was rare. She remembered her mother's hands, always gentle but sometimes trembling. She remembered her father's deep voice reading from the Bible in the evenings, the words washing over her like music, even when she didn't understand their meaning. She remembered being held at the window during storms, watching lightning fracture the sky, and feeling something within herself respond to that raw power. The manse had a particular smell that would stay with Minerva all her life. Old books and wool, the tang of peat smoke from the fire, her mother's lavender water, the mustiness of stone walls that had stood for centuries. In winter, frost painted elaborate patterns on the inside of the windows, and her father would warm her beside the hearth before bedtime, telling her stories of saints and miracles. In summer, the northern light lasted so long that bedtime seemed arbitrary, and she would lie awake listening to the wind in the eaves and the distant cry of seabirds wheeling over the cliffs. When Minerva was 3 years old, the first clear incident of magic occurred. Robert had been called away to visit a dying parishioner, and Isabel was in the kitchen preparing dinner. Minerva, playing alone in the sitting room, had been building a tower with wooden blocks. Higher and higher, her small face scrunched in concentration. The tower had grown taller than should have been physically possible, the blocks balancing in ways that defied ordinary physics. When it finally toppled, instead of crashing to the floor, the blocks floated down like autumn leaves, settling in a perfect spiral pattern on the carpet. Isabel, drawn by the unusual silence, found her daughter staring at her own hands with a mixture of delight and confusion. The truth could no longer be delayed. That night, after Minerva was asleep, Isabel climbed to the attic and retrieved her wand. For the first time in years, the hawthorn wood felt strange in her hand after so long, like greeting an old friend who had become a stranger. She sat in the darkness, holding it, feeling the magic pulse faintly through the wood, and wept for what she knew must come next. The conversation with Robert happened on a grey afternoon when rain hammered against the windows and the fire burned low in the grate. Isabel had sent Minerva to play in her room, though the child, with her uncanny awareness, probably sensed that something momentous was occurring. With shaking hands, Isabel told her husband everything. The world of magic that existed alongside his own, her education at Hogwarts, the abilities she possessed, and most importantly, the gift, or curse, that their daughter had inherited. Robert McGonagall was a man of deep faith, but he was not simple or rigid in his thinking. He listened without interruption as his wife showed him small magics, making the kettle boil without fire, causing a quill to write by itself, transforming a button into a beetle and back again. He watched her face, saw the pain and hope warring there, and understood that this revelation was both a relief and an agony for her. The world he thought he knew had shifted, but the woman he loved was still herself, perhaps more truly herself than she had been able to be in all their years of marriage. What followed was not anger, as Isabel had feared, but a kind of grief. Robert grieved for his wife's suffering, for the years she had spent hiding. He grieved for his own limited understanding of God's creation, which was apparently far stranger and more wondrous than his theology had prepared him for. And he worried, with the deep, aching worry of a father, about what this would mean for their daughter. Would she be taken away to this school, this Hogwarts? Would she be lost to a world he could never fully enter? But Robert McGonagall was, above all else, a loving man. He held his wife as she cried, and he promised to face this new reality together with her. When young Minerva appeared in the doorway, drawn by some instinct, he lifted her into his arms and kissed her forehead, whispering that she was loved, whatever she was, whatever she might become. The years that followed were easier in some ways, harder in others. Isabel could now teach Minerva openly, at least within the walls of their home. She retrieved her old textbooks and began instructing her daughter in the basics of magical theory, though wandless magic was all Minerva could perform, until she received her wand at 11. The child proved to be a prodigious student, absorbing information with remarkable speed and demonstrating an instinctive understanding of magical principles that suggested she would be formidable indeed once properly trained. Robert, unable to perform magic himself, but determined to understand his daughter's world, read everything Isabel could provide. He struggled with the concepts, as any muggle would, but he asked thoughtful questions and tried to see the divine hand in magic as he saw it in everything else. To him, Minerva's abilities were simply another manifestation of the Creator's infinite imagination, and if that required him to expand his understanding of what was possible, then his faith was large enough to accommodate such expansion. Minerva grew into a serious, intelligent child with a strong sense of right and wrong inherited from both parents. From her father, she learned discipline, duty, and the importance of service to others. From her mother, she learned the beauty and responsibility of magic, the way power must be tempered with wisdom. She played little with other village children, not because she was unfriendly, but because she was already different in ways they couldn't name, and children have a keen sense for such things. Instead, she roamed the moors with a book in her pocket, or helped her mother in the garden, or sat in her father's study while he worked on his sermons, reading whatever she could find. She developed a particular love for Transfiguration theory, even before she could properly practice it. The idea that things could be transformed, that nothing had to remain exactly as it appeared, resonated with something deep in her nature. Perhaps it was because she had watched her mother transform herself to fit into the Muggle world, or perhaps it was simply in her blood, an inheritance from generations of Ross family witches who had excelled in that demanding art. The standing stones on the moor became Minerva's favorite place. She would sit among them on summer evenings when the light lingered late, feeling the ancient magic that still clung to the weathered granite. Sometimes her mother joined her there, and they would practice together, simple transformations at first, matches into needles, stones into shells. Isabel taught her daughter not just the mechanics of magic, but its ethics. Magic was a gift and a responsibility, never to be used carelessly or for merely selfish ends. As Minerva approached school age, letters began arriving from Hogwarts. Not her acceptance letter yet, but correspondence between Isabel and the school, preparing for the day when Minerva would join the magical world fully. Professor Albus Dumbledore, then the Transfiguration teacher, wrote personally to inquire about the girl who reportedly showed such early promise. His letters were warm and encouraging, and he assured Isabel that Minerva would find her place at Hogwarts, would finally be among those who understood her completely. But a shadow hung over these preparations. The year was 1945, and even in remote Caithness, even in the separation between Muggle and magical worlds, the darkness of the age could be felt. The Muggle world had been torn by war, and whispers suggested that the magical world had its own conflicts, its own dark forces rising. Isabel worried about sending her daughter away into such uncertain times, but she also knew that Minerva needed proper training, needed to be with her own kind. Robert, for his part, tried to prepare himself for the loss of his daughter to a world he could never fully share. He drew closer to Minerva in those final years before Hogwarts, teaching her everything he could about living with integrity, about standing firm in one's convictions, about serving something greater than oneself. He taught her chess and was secretly proud when she began beating him regularly by age 9. He taught her to love learning for its own sake, not merely as a means to an end. On Minerva's 11th birthday, October 4th, 1946, the official letter arrived. It came not by owl. Isabel had arranged for more discreet delivery, given their circumstances, but by special messenger. The envelope was heavy cream parchment, addressed in emerald green ink to Miss Minerva McGonagall, the small bedroom, Presbyterian Manse, Caithness, Scotland. Inside, on parchment that seemed to glow faintly with its own light, was the acceptance letter to Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry, signed by Headmaster Armando Dippet. Minerva read the letter 3 times, her heart beating faster with each reading. This was it, the door opening to the world where she truly belonged, where her abilities would not have to be hidden or explained away. Yet as she looked up at her parents, her mother's eyes bright with unshed tears, her father's smile brave but wavering, she felt the first sharp pang of what it would mean to step through that door. She was leaving behind not just a house, but the only people who had known her entire life, who loved her for exactly who she was, magic and all. The wind rose outside, rattling the windows, and somewhere on the distant moors, the standing stones stood silent and eternal. Minerva McGonagall held her letter, standing at the threshold of her destiny, not yet understanding how profoundly this moment would shape not just her own life, but the lives of countless others yet to be born. The story of the greatest witch of her generation was only just beginning. The summer of 1946 passed in a strange twilight between two worlds. Minerva McGonagall, now 11 years old and officially a Hogwarts student-to-be, existed in a liminal space where the familiar routines of her childhood began to feel like memories, even as she lived them. The standing stones on the moor seemed to hum with anticipation when she visited them, and the wind itself appeared to whisper secrets she was only just beginning to understand. Her mother, Isabel, had become more animated than Minerva had ever seen her. Years of suppressed magical identity fell away like a heavy cloak discarded on a warm day. She pulled out her old Hogwarts trunk from the attic, a battered thing covered in faded travel stickers and scratched with the initials of previous owners, and spent hours showing Minerva its contents. There were robes that had gone out of fashion decades ago, textbooks with margins filled with Isabel's youthful handwriting, a few photographs where the subjects moved in that unsettling way. Muggle photographs never did. "This was my wand," Isabel said one evening, holding out the hawthorn wand with reverence. 9 inches, dragon heartstring core. It served me well, though I haven't used it properly in so many years. Soon you'll have your own. And oh, Minerva, there's nothing quite like the moment when a wand chooses you. Robert watched these exchanges with a mixture of wonder and melancholy. He was losing his daughter, not to death or distance alone, but to an entire world he could never truly enter. Yet he supported the preparations with characteristic grace, setting aside money he could ill afford for Minerva's school supplies, and reading everything about Hogwarts that Isabel could share with him. He made lists in his careful handwriting, items to purchase, questions to ask, dates to remember. The first incident of truly powerful magic occurred on a humid July night, when storms rolled in from the North Sea. Minerva had been having nightmares, not the ordinary fears of childhood, but vivid, almost prophetic dreams that left her gasping and disoriented. In one such dream, she had been trapped in a small, dark space, unable to move or cry out, while voices argued somewhere beyond her reach. She woke suddenly, her heart hammering, and in her panic, something inside her broke free. Every window in the manse flew open simultaneously. The curtains billowed inward like living things, and the very air seemed to crystallize with energy. Downstairs, books flew from shelves. In the kitchen, every cupboard door banged open and shut in rapid succession. The storm outside intensified, lightning striking close enough to rattle the stones of the house, and for one breathless moment, young Minerva McGonagall hung suspended in the center of a vortex of pure magical force. Isabel reached her first, speaking calmly through the chaos. "Breathe, darling. Breathe, and let it go gently. You're safe. Nothing can hurt you here." Her voice, steady and sure, cut through Minerva's panic. Slowly, the girl regained control. The windows settled, the curtains fell limp, the books stopped their frantic dancing. Minerva collapsed back onto her bed, shaking and exhausted, while her mother held her and stroked her hair. That, Isabel said softly, is what happens when powerful magic has no proper outlet. At Hogwarts, you'll learn to channel it, to shape it, to make it serve your will rather than overwhelming you. But you must never be ashamed of your power, Minerva. Power itself is neither good nor evil. It's what we choose to do with it that matters. Robert appeared in the doorway, his face pale but composed. "Is she all right?" "She's more than all right," Isabel replied, smiling despite her concern. "She's extraordinary." The incident accelerated their plans. It was clear that Minerva needed proper training sooner rather than later, and waiting until September 1st seemed suddenly dangerous. Isabel wrote to Hogwarts, explaining the situation, and received a swift reply from Professor Dumbledore himself. He suggested they come to London early, visit Diagon Alley, and purchase Minerva's supplies with plenty of time for her to begin acclimating to the magical world before term started. And so, on a bright August morning, the McGonagall family made their way south. It was Minerva's first time leaving Scotland, her first time on a train that travelled such vast distances. Robert had borrowed money from his brother to afford the journey, insisting that he would see his daughter properly prepared for her new life, regardless of the cost. They stayed in a modest London boarding house near King's Cross Station, in a neighbourhood where the buildings pressed close together and the air tasted of coal smoke and possibility. Isabel had been to London before, during her own Hogwarts years, but the city had changed in the years since. Or perhaps she had changed and saw it now through different eyes. She led her family through streets that Robert found bewildering, past shops and churches and monuments, until they stood before the leaky cauldron. To Robert, and to any other muggle passing by, it appeared to be nothing more than a grimy gap between a bookshop and a record store. But Minerva saw it clearly, a small, grubby pub that seemed to crouch between its neighbours, its sign creaking in a breeze that didn't touch anything else on the street. "You can see it," Isabel said with satisfaction, "as I knew you would." Inside, the leaky cauldron was dark and shabby, smelling of cabbage and old pipe smoke. A few witches and wizards sat hunched over drinks at scarred wooden tables, and behind the bar, Tom the landlord, ancient even then, polished glasses with a rag that looked like it had never been clean. He nodded to Isabel with the air of one who recognized her kind, if not her specifically, and jerked his head toward the back door. "First time for the young miss, is it?" "First time," Isabel confirmed. "Well then, she's in for a treat." The courtyard behind the pub was small and cramped, enclosed by high walls. Robert looked around, clearly confused about what was supposed to be special about this dingy space. But Isabel drew her wand, and Minerva saw her father flinch slightly at the sight of it, a reminder that some things would always be foreign to him, and tapped a specific pattern on the bricks above the dustbin. The wall shivered and began to rearrange itself. Bricks slid aside with soft grinding sounds, revealing an archway that grew wider and wider until it formed an opening large enough to walk through. Beyond it, Minerva caught her first glimpse of Diagon Alley, and her breath stopped in her throat. Dear listener, imagine seeing magic, true, unbridled, magnificent magic, gathered and concentrated in one place for the first time. Imagine shops that sold wands and cauldrons, owls and telescopes, robes that repaired themselves, and books that bit unwary fingers. Imagine witches and wizards walking openly, wands tucked in belts or pockets, discussing the weather and the latest Quidditch scores and the price of dragon liver as casually as muggles might discuss cricket or rations. Imagine the air itself seeming to shimmer with possibility. The alley stretched before them, cobblestoned and crooked, lined with establishments whose windows displayed wonders beyond imagination. Minerva's eyes tried to take in everything at once. The shops selling Quidditch supplies, where broomsticks hovered in elegant formation. Flourish and Blot's bookshop with its towers of leather-bound volumes. Aelop's Owl Emporium, where dozens of amber eyes watched the passers-by with unsettling intelligence. People jostled past, young witches in robes of plum and emerald, elderly wizards with beards tucked into their belts, harried mothers dragging reluctant children. Robert held Minerva's hand tightly, his own eyes wide with wonder and perhaps a touch of fear. This was a world that had no place for him, where he would always be an outsider, and Minerva could feel the tension in his grip. But Isabel walked ahead with confidence renewed, her spine straight, her head high. For the first time in Minerva's memory, her mother looked completely at home. Their first stop was Gringotts, the Wizarding Bank. The white building towered over its neighbors, imposing and austere, with burnished bronze doors that gleamed in the August sun. Robert hesitated at the threshold, but Minerva pulled him forward, too excited now to be cautious. Inside, they found themselves in a vast marble hall, and there, behind the counters that stretched along one wall, sat the goblins. Minerva had read about goblins in her mother's books, but reading about them and seeing them were entirely different experiences. They were shorter than she expected, with clever dark eyes and long fingers that moved with precision over ledgers and scales. One goblin in particular watched their approach with an expression that might have been amusement or disdain. With goblins, it was often difficult to tell. Isabel conducted her business efficiently, withdrawing gold galleons from the Ross family vault. A small vault, not wealthy by wizarding standards, but sufficient for Hogwarts supplies. Minerva watched the coins tumble into the leather bag with fascination. They were heavy and real, stamped with unfamiliar symbols, warm to the touch as though recently minted. This was her first tangible connection to the wizarding economy, to a system that existed entirely parallel to the pounds and pence her father dealt with daily. From Gringotts, they made their way to Madame Malkin's robes for all occasions. The shop was pleasantly cluttered, with bolts of fabric stacked haphazardly, and a fitting area toward the back, where a kindly witch directed Minerva to stand on a stool. Measuring tapes sprang to life, zipping around her arms and legs and torso, with no hand to guide them, while Madame Malkin herself pinned and tucked and made approving noises. "Good posture," she noted. "You'll wear robes well, dear." "I can always tell. Some students slouch and shuffle, makes the fabric hang all wrong. But you've got bearing. Mark my words, you'll cut quite a figure at Hogwarts." Minerva felt a flush of pride at this pronouncement. She watched herself in the mirror as the plain black robes took shape around her, and for the first time, she saw herself as she might appear to her future classmates, a young witch, serious and composed, ready to learn. The image pleased her in a way she didn't quite understand yet. It was the picture of who she might become, given time and training. They purchased 3 sets of plain robes, 1 winter cloak with silver fastenings, and a pointed hat that Minerva privately thought looked rather ridiculous, though she said nothing. Robert paid with the galleons Isabel had converted for him, counting them out carefully while Madame Malkin watched, with barely concealed impatience. Muggle-raised wizards and their parents, her expression seemed to say, always took so long with the simplest transactions. Lunch was purchased from a vendor selling something called cauldron cakes, dense, rich pastries that tasted of chocolate and something indefinable that Minerva suspected might be magic itself. They ate on a bench near Florian Fortescue's ice cream parlor, watching the crowds flow past. Robert was quiet, processing everything he'd seen, while Isabel pointed out interesting passers-by and explained various aspects of wizarding culture. That wizard there, with the purple robes, see how elaborately embroidered they are, that suggests he's either wealthy or wants people to think he is. And there, that witch carrying the caged puffskein. Those are popular pets, very affectionate and low maintenance, though they do make a humming noise that some people find irritating. And that shop across the way, Wiseacre's Wizarding Equipment. We'll need to visit there for your telescope and files. Minerva absorbed everything like a sponge, her mind cataloguing details, making connections, beginning to understand the unwritten rules and social structures of this new world. She noticed how some wizards and witches walked with wands openly displayed, while others kept them hidden. She observed the way shop owners greeted certain customers with warmth and others with mere professionalism. She saw hierarchies and histories in every interaction, and her quick mind began mapping the social landscape she would soon navigate as a student. But the most important stop, the one they had saved for last, was Ollivander's, makers of fine wands. Since 382 BC, the shop was narrow and shabby, with a single wand resting on a faded purple cushion in the dusty window. A sign above the door proclaimed in peeling gold letters the shop's ancient heritage. Minerva felt her pulse quicken as her mother pushed open the door, and a tinkling bell announced their arrival. The interior was dimly lit and smelled of wood and something older, something that might have been time itself. Thousands of narrow boxes were stacked in tottering towers that reached toward the shadowed ceiling. The shop appeared empty at first, silent and waiting, but then a voice spoke from the dimness at the back. "Good afternoon." Mr. Ollivander materialized from between the stacks of boxes like a pale ghost. His wide, silvery eyes gleamed in the gloom, unsettling in their intensity. He looked at Minerva with an expression that suggested he could see straight through skin and bone to something essential underneath. "Ah, yes," he said softly. "Yes, I remember your mother. Miss Isabel Ross, wasn't it? Hawthorn and dragon heartstring, 9 inches, quite rigid, excellent for transfiguration work as I recall. And now, here is her daughter, seeking a wand of her own." He circled Minerva slowly, those luminous eyes never blinking. "Let me see, which is your wand arm?" "Right," Minerva answered, her voice steadier than she felt. Ollivander produced a long tape measure marked with silver symbols. "Hold out your arm, please." The tape measure sprang to life, measuring her arm from shoulder to fingertip, from wrist to elbow, from fingers to wrist, around her head, between her eyes, and several other measurements that seemed to have no practical purpose. Finally, it collapsed back into Ollivander's hand. "Every wand is unique," he murmured, already climbing a rolling ladder to retrieve boxes from the higher shelves. "The wand chooses the wizard, Miss McGonagall. It's not always clear why, but when the match is made, you'll know beyond any doubt." He handed her wand after wand, elm and phoenix feather. She had barely touched it before Ollivander snatched it back with a sharp, "No, definitely not." Willow and unicorn hair. She managed a small shower of sparks before he whisked it away. Cedar and dragon heartstring. The room temperature dropped several degrees, and Ollivander quickly retrieved it from her startled grasp. "Curious, very curious," he muttered, pulling down more boxes. "Strong magic, very strong indeed, but particular. Very particular about what will suit." Box after box was opened and rejected. Robert shifted uncomfortably by the door, clearly disturbed by the strange ritual, while Isabel watched with an encouraging smile. Minerva felt a growing anxiety. What if no one chose her? What if she was somehow incompatible with the very tools that made magic possible? Then Ollivander paused, his hand hovering over a box that looked older than the others, its label faded and barely legible. "Perhaps," he whispered. "Yes, perhaps this one." He drew out a wand of unusual length and handed it to Minerva with a reverence he hadn't shown for the others. Fur and dragon heartstring, 9.5 inches, rigid. Try this. The moment Minerva's fingers closed around the dark wood, she felt it. A warmth that spread from her palm up her arm and through her entire body. The wand vibrated gently, almost like a purr, and when she gave it a small flick, a stream of red and gold sparks shot from its tip, swirling around the shop before fading like dying embers. "Oh yes," Ollivander breathed. "Oh yes, excellent. Fur is demanding. It requires a wand owner with focus and vision, someone who will not be swayed from their chosen path. Dragon heartstring adds power and precision. Together, they suggest a witch of considerable talent and even greater determination. I suspect great things from you, Miss McGonagall, great things indeed." Minerva held her wand, and felt complete in a way she never had before. This was the missing piece, the final key to unlocking everything she was meant to be. Isabel's eyes shone with tears as she paid the 7 galleons, and even Robert seemed moved, understanding on some intuitive level that something profound had just occurred. They made their remaining purchases in a happy blur. A pewter cauldron size 2, a set of brass scales, a telescope, crystal phials, and a basic potions kit. At Flourish and Blots, they bought all the required textbooks, and Minerva convinced her mother to purchase several additional volumes, including A Beginner's Guide to Transfiguration and 1,000 Magical Herbs and Fungi. Finally, against Minerva's protests that she didn't need one, Isabel insisted on buying her an owl from Elop's Owl Emporium. The owl they selected, or rather, who selected Minerva, was a handsome tawny with amber eyes and a dignified bearing. He perched on Minerva's shoulder with an air of patient tolerance, occasionally nipping gently at her ear as if to remind her of his presence. She named him Perseus, after the Greek hero, and he would be her faithful companion throughout her Hogwarts years. That night, back in their boarding house room, Minerva lay awake long after her parents had fallen asleep. Her wand rested on the bedside table, seeming to glow faintly in the darkness, though that might have been her imagination. Tomorrow they would return to Scotland, to Caithness and the manse and the familiar routines of home. But everything had changed. She had seen her future, touched it, claimed it as her own. On September 1st, she would board the Hogwarts Express. She would be sorted into a house, begin her magical education, and step fully into the destiny that had been calling her since birth. The thought filled her with equal parts anticipation and trepidation. Who would she become in that ancient castle? What would she learn? What friendships would she forge? What challenges would she face? Outside, London rumbled and hissed, a city that never truly slept. But inside, young Minerva McGonagall drifted toward dreams, her hand unconsciously reaching out to touch her wand one more time before sleep claimed her. The awakening had begun, and there would be no going back to the child she had been just days before. The 1st of September, 1946, dawned cool and misty over the Scottish Highlands. Minerva McGonagall woke before sunrise, though she had barely slept, her mind too full of anticipation and nervous energy to find proper rest. She dressed carefully in her new robes, which still smelled faintly of Madame Malkin's shop, a mixture of starch and cedar, and something indefinably magical. Her trunk stood packed and ready by the door, her wand secure in her pocket. Perseus dozing in his cage, with one amber eye occasionally cracking open to observe her restless movements. Isabel made breakfast, though none of them had much appetite. Robert sat at the table, turning his teacup in slow circles, memorizing the sight of his daughter in her Hogwarts robes, trying to fix this moment in his memory. The kitchen, which had been the heart of their family life for 11 years, felt suddenly smaller, as though the walls themselves knew that their circle was breaking. "You're right," Robert said, not for the first time. "Every week, even if it's just a few lines. I want to know you're well, that you're happy." "I will, Father," Minerva promised, her voice thick with emotion she was trying desperately to control. She had inherited her mother's magical talent and her father's stoic disposition, and crying at the breakfast table seemed beneath the dignity of a future Hogwarts student. Yet the tears threatened anyway, burning behind her eyes. The journey south was long and subdued. Robert had arranged for a neighbour to drive them to Inverness, where they caught the train to London. Minerva watched the highlands roll past the window, the heather-clad hills, the silver locks, the standing stones that had been her childhood companions, and wondered when she would see them again. Christmas seemed impossibly far away, an eternity for an 11-year-old leaving home for the first time. King's Cross Station was chaos incarnate when they arrived. Muggles rushed in every direction, luggage carts rattling, whistles blowing, the great arched ceiling echoing with 1,000 conversations. But Isabel led them confidently through the crowds towards a barrier between platforms 9 and 10. To the casual observer, it appeared to be nothing more than solid brick, but Minerva could feel the magic emanating from it, a gentle thrumming that called to something deep in her bones. "Watch carefully," Isabel said, though she needn't have worried. Minerva was watching everything with the intense focus that would become her trademark. A family ahead of them, clearly wizarding folk, given the owl cage and cauldron visible on their trolley, approached the barrier at a brisk walk and simply melted through it, there one moment and gone the next. "You just walk straight at it," Isabel explained. "Don't stop, don't hesitate. The magic will do the rest." Robert kissed his daughter's forehead one last time, his hands trembling slightly as they rested on her shoulders. "Be good, be brave, be yourself." His voice cracked on the last word, and Minerva threw her arms around him in a fierce embrace, all her carefully maintained composure crumbling. "I love you, Father, and I you, my girl. More than all the magic in all the worlds." Then Isabel was guiding her toward the barrier, and Minerva was walking, the solid brick rushing toward her face, every instinct screaming to stop. And then she was through, emerging onto platform 9 3/4 in a cloud of steam and wonder. The Hogwarts Express stood gleaming crimson in the morning light, its engine breathing gently like a sleeping dragon. Smoke curled from its stack, and all along its length, students were saying goodbye to their families, loading trunks, finding compartments with friends. The platform buzzed with excitement and magic barely contained. Minerva saw things she'd only read about in books. Older students performing casual charms to levitate their luggage, a wizard selling pumpkin pasties from a hovering tray, a group of first years clustered together in nervous solidarity. Isabel helped her load her trunk onto the train, checking and rechecking that everything was properly stowed. "Remember," she said, taking Minerva's face in both hands, "you're a Ross and a McGonagall both. You carry the strength of two worlds. Never forget where you come from, but don't let it limit where you're going. I won't, Minerva whispered, and then the whistle was blowing, and she was climbing aboard, finding an empty compartment near the middle of the train. She pressed her face to the window as the train began to move, watching her mother wave until she was just a speck, then nothing at all, swallowed by the steam and the distance. Dear listener, can you remember your own first journey into the unknown? That mixture of exhilaration and terror, of wanting desperately to go forward while longing to turn back. Minerva felt all of this as the train gathered speed, leaving London behind, carrying her toward a future she could not yet imagine. She sat very straight in her seat, her hands folded in her lap, determined to meet whatever came with dignity and courage. The compartment door slid open, and a girl with copper-colored hair and a friendly smile poked her head in. Mind if I sit here? Everywhere else is full of older students showing off their holiday adventures, and I'd rather not watch another demonstration of stinging hexes, thank you very much. Please, Minerva said, grateful for the company. I'm Minerva McGonagall. Pomona Sprout, the girl replied, settling herself across from Minerva with a cheerful bounce. First year? Me too. Are you nervous? I'm absolutely terrified. Well, not terrified exactly. More like excited terrified, if that makes sense. My mum's a Hufflepuff, so she's told me loads about Hogwarts, but hearing about it and actually going there are probably completely different things, aren't they? Minerva found herself warming to Pomona's easy chatter. Over the course of the journey, they were joined by two others. A quiet boy named Herbert Fleet, who was Muggle-born and had 100 nervous questions about everything, and a sharp-featured girl called Griselda Marchbanks, who announced that she intended to become the youngest person ever to achieve 12 OWLS. The four of them shared sweets from the trolley. Bertie Bott's, every flavour beans. Minerva got grass on her first try, and soap on her second. Chocolate frogs, she collected Morgana's card, and pumpkin pasties that tasted like autumn itself. They changed into their robes as the landscape outside shifted from English countryside to wilder, more rugged terrain. As darkness fell, the train began to climb into mountains, and Minerva caught glimpses of forests that looked older than time, of locks that reflected the first stars, of a land that remembered magic in its very bones. We'll be there soon, Pomona said, pressing her nose to the window. Mum said you can see the castle from the train just before you arrive, all lit up on its hill like a crown of stars. And then, as if summoned by her words, it appeared. Hogwarts Castle rose from the landscape, like a dream-made stone, towers and turrets reaching toward the night sky, windows glowing golden, the whole magnificent structure perched on a cliff above a vast black lake. Minerva's breath caught in her throat. She had seen drawings in her mother's books, had heard descriptions, but nothing had prepared her for the reality of it. The castle was enormous, ancient, and impossibly beautiful, radiating magic so powerful she could feel it even from this distance. The train slowed and finally stopped at a small station, Hogsmeade, according to the sign. Students poured out onto the platform in a chaotic swirl of robes and excitement. Then a voice boomed across the crowd. First years over here. A giant of a man, truly giant, at least 12 feet tall, held a lamp high above the crowd. His face was almost entirely hidden by a wild tangle of black hair and beard. but his beetle-black eyes twinkled kindly. "Come on, don't be shy. First years, this way." Minerva and her new companions followed the giant, who introduced himself as Og, the Hogwarts gamekeeper, down a steep, narrow path that wound through trees. Then they emerged onto the shore of the Black Lake, where small boats waited, bobbing gently on the dark water. "No more than 4 to a boat," Og instructed. "They'll take you across by themselves. Off you go." Minerva climbed into a boat with Pomona, Herbert, and Griselda. The moment they were settled, the boat began moving of its own accord, gliding smoothly across the glassy surface. The castle loomed larger and larger, its reflection shimmering in the water, like a second Hogwarts existing in Mirror World below. Other boats moved around them in a magical flotilla, and Minerva heard gasps and whispers as the first years approached their new home. They passed under an ivy-covered cliff, through a curtain of hanging plants, and into an underground harbour where they disembarked onto rocks and pebbles, then up more stairs. Minerva would soon learn that Hogwarts consisted primarily of stairs, until they stood in front of the castle's enormous oak front doors. Og knocked 3 times, and the doors swung open to reveal a tall witch in emerald robes. Professor Winifred Warwick, the deputy headmistress, had a stern face but kind eyes. She surveyed the group of first years with an expression that managed to be both welcoming and forbidding. "Welcome to Hogwarts," she said, her voice carrying clearly over the nervous shuffling. "The start of term banquet will begin shortly, but before you take your seats in the Great Hall, you will be sorted into your houses. The sorting is a very important ceremony because while you are here, your house will be something like your family within Hogwarts." She went on to explain the 4 houses: Gryffindor, Hufflepuff, Ravenclaw, and Slytherin, and their different qualities. Minerva listened intently, her mind already analyzing where she might belong. Gryffindor for the brave, Hufflepuff for the loyal, Ravenclaw for the clever, Slytherin for the ambitious. She possessed elements of all these traits. But which would the sorting hat? Yes, Professor Warwick had mentioned a hat, which seemed odd, but no stranger than anything else. Deemed most dominant. They waited in a small chamber off the Great Hall, the sound of hundreds of voices filtering through the doors. Minerva used the time to smooth her robes, to run through everything her mother had taught her about maintaining composure, to prepare herself mentally for whatever tests the sorting might entail. Some students around her were nearly sick with anxiety. Others whispered theories about what the sorting would involve: practical examinations, written tests, duels. Minerva suspected it would be stranger and more subtle than any of these guesses. Finally, Professor Warwick returned and led them into the Great Hall. Minerva's first glimpse of that magnificent space would stay with her for the rest of her life. The hall was vast, lit by thousands of candles floating in mid-air above 4 long tables, where the older students sat watching the newcomers. The ceiling was bewitched to look like the sky outside, stars gleaming, clouds drifting, the moon hanging like a silver coin. At the far end, on a raised platform, the teachers sat at the high table, and in the center, in a high-backed golden chair, sat Headmaster Armando Dippet, his white beard flowing over his chest like a waterfall. But it was the object on a stool in front of the high table that drew every eye. An old patched wizard's hat, pointed and frayed, sat perfectly still. Then, to Minerva's amazement, a rip near the brim opened like a mouth, and the hat began to sing. The Sorting Hat song that year spoke of the founders, Godric Gryffindor, Helga Hufflepuff, Rowena Ravenclaw, and Salazar Slytherin, and the qualities they valued. It sang of courage and loyalty, wit and ambition, and promised to see into each student's mind to place them where they belonged. When the song ended, Professor Warwick began calling names alphabetically. Minerva watched as one by one her fellow first years approached the stool, sat down, and had the enormous hat placed on their heads. Sometimes the hat shouted its decision immediately. Other times it seemed to deliberate. Pomona Sprout, when her turn came, had barely sat down before the hat called Hufflepuff, and she bounded off to the table on the right, beaming with joy. McGonagall, Minerva. Her legs felt strange as she walked forward, aware of hundreds of eyes upon her. She sat on the stool, and Professor Warwick lowered the hat onto her head. It fell down over her eyes, blocking out the great hall, and then a small voice spoke in her ear, or perhaps in her mind. Said the hat softly, "Another Ross. I remember your mother, you know, Gryffindor, through and through, though she had the wit for Ravenclaw. And you, oh my, yes, you're interesting. Tremendous intellect. You could do very well in Ravenclaw, learn much, become a scholar of note. That mind of yours is quite remarkable, Miss McGonagall. But there's more, isn't there? Steel beneath the scholarship, courage that goes bone deep, a determination to do what's right, no matter the personal cost. Yes, I see it clearly. Not the reckless courage of some, but something more refined, more enduring. You'll need it, I think, for what lies ahead." The hat seemed to deliberate, and Minerva felt a moment of panic. What if it couldn't decide? What if she was sorted into Ravenclaw when her heart was already calling out for Gryffindor, the house her mother had loved? Gryffindor, you think? The hat murmured, responding to her unspoken thought. Well, if you're certain. Though, remember, Miss McGonagall, the mind is a powerful weapon, and you mustn't neglect it in favor of valor alone. Use both, and you'll be formidable indeed. Very well, then. Better be Gryffindor. The last word was shouted to the hall, and the table on the far left erupted in cheers. Minerva removed the hat with shaking hands, handed it back to Professor Warwick, and walked toward her new house. The older students clapped and made room for her, welcoming her with smiles and congratulations. She sat down, her heart hammering, and allowed herself a small smile. Gryffindor. She was a Gryffindor, like her mother before her. The sorting continued, and Minerva watched as her compartment mates were dispersed to different houses. Herbert to Ravenclaw, Griselda to Slytherin. When the last student was sorted, Headmaster Dippet rose and spread his arms in welcome. His speech was mercifully brief, and then, with a clap of his hands, the tables filled with food. Such food, dear listener. Roast beef and roast chicken, pork chops and lamb chops, sausages and bacon, steak and kidney pie, boiled potatoes and roast potatoes, Yorkshire pudding, peas and carrots, and gravy so rich it gleamed. For dessert, there were blocks of ice cream in every flavor imaginable, apple pies, treacle tarts, chocolate eclairs, jam donuts, and more. Minerva ate until she thought she might burst, laughing at the jokes of her new housemates, beginning to learn names and faces. After the feast, the Gryffindor prefect, a confident seventh year named Quentin Travers, led the first years through the castle's winding corridors. Minerva tried to memorize the route, noting the trick steps, the paintings whose subjects moved and spoke, the suits of armor standing sentinel in alcoves. They climbed staircase after staircase, the stairs themselves shifting occasionally, reconnecting to different landings, until they reached the 7th floor and stopped before a portrait of a very fat lady in a pink silk dress. "Password?" the fat lady inquired. "Fortitudo," Quentin said clearly, and the portrait swung forward like a door, revealing a round opening in the wall. Through the opening lay the Gryffindor common room, and Minerva felt immediately at home. The room was circular and cozy, furnished with squashy armchairs and tables, hangings in scarlet and gold, a fireplace crackling merrily. Windows looked out over the grounds, though it was too dark to see much beyond the glass. The room smelled of old books and wood smoke, and felt like comfort itself, a refuge from the vastness of the castle, a place where she belonged. The girls' dormitories were up a spiral staircase, and Minerva found herself sharing a room with 4 other first-year girls: Lucinda Talcott, who talked incessantly; Alice Hornby, who was homesick and cried quietly into her pillow; Beatrice Hayward, who immediately produced a tin of biscuits and offered them around; and Edith Crowley, who barely spoke but smiled warmly at everyone. Minerva's trunk sat at the foot of her 4-poster bed, which had scarlet hangings and the softest pillows she'd ever felt. She unpacked methodically, putting everything in its proper place, hanging her robes in the wardrobe, arranging her books on the small shelf. Perseus was already asleep in his cage, having been transported to the dormitory by means Minerva didn't quite understand. Through the window, she could see the grounds stretching dark and mysterious under the stars. She changed into her nightclothes and climbed into bed, drawing the hangings for privacy. In the darkness, she touched her wand one more time, feeling its comforting presence, and allowed herself to acknowledge the enormity of what had happened. She was here. She was at Hogwarts. She was a Gryffindor. Her real education was about to begin. Tomorrow would bring her first classes, her first lessons in the subjects she'd only read about. Tomorrow, she would begin to discover what kind of witch she might become. But tonight, tired beyond measure and overwhelmed with new impressions, Minerva McGonagall closed her eyes and let sleep claim her, safe in her tower, cradled by magic, surrounded by the beginning of a life she could not yet imagine in its fullness. The years passed at Hogwarts like water flowing over ancient stones, swift yet somehow eternal, each moment distinct yet blending into a continuous stream of learning and growth. Minerva McGonagall proved to be everything the Sorting Hat had predicted: brilliant, disciplined, and possessed of a quiet courage that emerged most clearly in moments of crisis. She excelled in nearly every subject, but it was Transfiguration where she truly shone, demonstrating an intuitive grasp of the subject that even impressed Professor Dumbledore, whose standards were notoriously exacting. By her 7th year, Minerva had become head girl, a position she wore with characteristic dignity and fairness. She had earned 12 OWLs, all with outstanding grades, and was widely expected to achieve similar results in her NEWTS. She had mastered the theory and practice of becoming an animagus, though she had not yet registered with the ministry, waiting until after graduation to make her transformation official. When she finally achieved her animal form, a silver tabby cat with distinctive square markings around her eyes, the sense of rightness had been overwhelming, as though she had discovered a part of herself that had always existed, merely waiting to be revealed. But dear listener, even the most dedicated scholar cannot live on books and accomplishment alone. As Minerva prepared to leave Hogwarts in the summer of 1954, she was not only an exceptional young witch, but also a woman standing at the threshold of a complex and uncertain future. The wizarding world beyond the castle walls was changing in ways both subtle and profound, and Minerva would soon discover that the most difficult lessons cannot be learned from textbooks. She had received offers from several prestigious institutions. The Ministry of Magic's Department of Magical Law Enforcement wanted her for their Aura training program. The Department of Mysteries had sent a cryptic letter suggesting she possessed suitable qualities for specialized research. Professor Dumbledore himself had encouraged her to consider a teaching position at Hogwarts once she had gained some experience in the wider world. But Minerva, practical and methodical even in matters of her own future, had accepted a position in the Ministry's Department of Magical Law Enforcement, believing that service to the magical community was the highest calling she could pursue. The summer before she began her ministry career, Minerva returned to Caithness. The manse seemed smaller than she remembered, though nothing about it had actually changed. Her father, now greying at the temples and moving with the careful deliberation of advancing age, embraced her with tears in his eyes. Her mother, still vital and sharp despite the years, held her at arm's length to examine her properly. "Look at you," Isabel said softly, "a woman grown. And such a woman. I see the witch you've become, Minerva, and I am so very proud." Those weeks in Caithness had a dreamlike quality. Minerva walked the moors she had explored as a child, visited the standing stones that had witnessed her early magical experiments, and spent long evenings by the fire talking with her parents about everything and nothing. Robert wanted to hear about her classes and her achievements. Isabel wanted to know about the practical applications of what she'd learned, about the political currents moving through the wizarding world, about whether Dumbledore was as brilliant as everyone said. But it was during a village Chelith, a traditional Scottish gathering with music and dancing, that Minerva's life took a turn she had not anticipated. She had attended somewhat reluctantly, accompanying her father, who had been asked to offer a blessing for the community. The village hall was crowded with familiar faces, people she had known all her life, but who now seemed to belong to a different world entirely, a Muggle world that felt increasingly foreign to her despite her roots in it. That was when she saw Dougal McGregor. He was a few years older than Minerva, the son of a local farmer, with strong hands and kind eyes and a smile that seemed to carry the warmth of summer itself. They had known each other as children, had played together in those years before Minerva went away to school. But he had changed in the intervening time, as had she. He asked her to dance with an old-fashioned courtesy that charmed her, and as they moved through the steps of a traditional Scottish reel, Minerva felt something stir in her chest that had nothing to do with magic and everything to do with being human. They began seeing each other, though Minerva knew from the first that it was complicated, perhaps impossible. Dougal was Muggle-born and Muggle-raised, with no knowledge of the magical world. He was rooted in Caithness in a way Minerva no longer was, committed to taking over his father's farm, to living a life of honest labor close to the land. But he was also intelligent and curious. well read despite his lack of formal education, with a philosophical bent that led to long conversations about ethics and purpose and the nature of a life well lived. As the summer progressed, Minerva found herself torn between two worlds more acutely than ever before. With Dougal, she could almost imagine a different life, a simpler life perhaps, but one rich with human connection and rooted in the landscape she loved. But she was a witch with responsibilities and abilities that set her apart. The international statute of secrecy meant she could not tell him the truth about herself without potentially destroying everything he believed about reality. And even if she could tell him, what then? Would she abandon her magical career to be a farmer's wife? Would she ask him to leave his land and somehow enter a world he couldn't fully participate in? One evening in late August, as they walked along the cliffs overlooking the North Sea, Dougal stopped and turned to her. The setting sun painted the sky in shades of amber and rose, and the wind carried the salt-sharp scent of the ocean. He took her hands in his, and Minerva's heart began to race because she knew what was coming. "Minerva," he said, his voice steady despite the emotion in his eyes. "I know you're meant for greater things than life in a small village. I've always known that about you. There's something special, something I can't quite name that sets you apart. But I love you, and I'm asking if you might consider staying. Marry me. Build a life here. I can't offer you riches or adventure, but I can offer you honesty and loyalty and a love that won't waver." Dear listener, have you ever faced a choice where both paths led away from something precious? Where either decision meant a kind of loss? Minerva stood on those windswept cliffs, looking at a good man who loved her, and felt her heart breaking even as she knew what her answer must be. "Dougal," she said softly, and the tears that had threatened spilled over. "You honor me more than you know, but I can't stay. There are things about me, about my life, that I can never fully explain to you. Not because I don't want to, but because there are rules, laws that bind me. I care for you deeply, more deeply than I knew was possible. But I would be living a lie if I stayed. And you deserve someone who can give you all of herself, honestly and completely." He held her as she cried, though she could feel his own pain in the tension of his body, in the careful way he stroked her hair. "Is there someone else?" he asked finally. "In that life you're going back to?" "No," she answered honestly. "No one else. Just obligations and duties, and a path I chose long ago before I understood what choosing it would cost." They stood together as the sun sank below the horizon and the first stars emerged. Then Dougal kissed her forehead gently, released her, and walked back toward the village alone. Minerva remained on the cliffs, staring out at the darkening sea, feeling the full weight of her choice settle onto her shoulders like a cloak of stone. She left for London a week later, said her goodbyes to her parents with a forced brightness that fooled neither of them, and threw herself into her work at the ministry with a fierce dedication that her colleagues interpreted as ambition, but was really a form of escape. The Ministry of Magic was housed deep beneath London, a labyrinth of corridors and offices lit by torches that never went out. Minerva's position in the Department of Magical Law Enforcement involved policy work rather than field operations, analyzing magical crimes, proposing legislative reforms, liaising between different departments. She was good at it, efficient and thorough, but she found no joy in it. The work felt removed from real magic, buried in paperwork and bureaucracy. She missed teaching, though she had never actually taught. She missed Hogwarts with an ache that surprised her. The castle's ancient stones, the moving staircases, the sense of being part of something larger and more meaningful than a political maneuvering. Then, 6 months after she had left Caithness, a letter arrived from her mother. Minerva opened it during her lunch break, sitting alone in her small ministry office, and the words seemed to leap from the page and pierce her heart. My dearest Minerva, I'm sorry to be the bearer of sad news. Dougal McGregor was killed 3 days ago in a farming accident. His horse startled and threw him, and he struck his head on a stone wall. He died instantly, they say, without pain. The funeral was yesterday. Your father spoke beautifully about the goodness of his character and the tragedy of a life cut short. I know this will grieve you, darling. I'm so very sorry. The letter fell from Minerva's numb fingers. The office around her seemed to recede, becoming distant and unreal. Dougal was dead. The man she had loved, yes, she could admit it now, she had loved him, was gone from the world, and she had not even been there to say goodbye. Worse, she had left him with a broken heart, had refused him without being able to give him a full explanation. And now he would never know why, never understand that her refusal had been an act of painful honesty rather than casual rejection. Minerva McGonagall, who prided herself on control and composure, sat in her office and wept as she had not wept since childhood. She mourned not only Dougal's death, but also the life she might have had, the choice she had made, the cost of keeping secrets, the international statute of secrecy, which she had always understood intellectually as necessary for the protection of the magical community, suddenly felt like a prison wall separating her from the full expression of her humanity. She requested leave from the ministry and returned to Scotland for a week. She visited Dougal's grave, a simple stone in the kirkyard where her father preached, and stood there in the rain trying to find words for a prayer or a farewell. But the words wouldn't come. Finally, she simply placed her hand on the cold stone and whispered, I'm sorry for everything I couldn't be, everything I couldn't give you. You deserve better than half-truths and guarded hearts. The grief changed her. When Minerva returned to London, she moved through her days with mechanical efficiency, but something essential had hollowed out inside her. She began to question whether she was using her gifts in the right way, whether policy work and legislative reform were really what she was meant for. Late at night, lying in her small flat in a Muggle neighborhood where no one knew she was a witch, she would transform into her animagus form and prowl the rooftops, finding a strange comfort in the simplicity of feline existence. No words, no choices, no moral complexities, just the night and the movement, and the freedom of a different kind of being. It was during this dark period that Elphinstone Urquhart re-entered her life. They had known each other at Hogwarts. He had been several years ahead of her, a Ravenclaw prefect when she was a first-year student. He had gone on to become a respected educator, teaching at a wizarding school in the Scottish borders. They met again by chance at a ministry function, and Elphinstone, with the gentle perceptiveness that characterized him, saw past her professional facade to the grief beneath. He began writing to her, letters that made no demands but offered intellectual companionship and quiet understanding. They discussed magical theory, educational philosophy, current events in the wizarding world. Gradually, carefully, they developed a friendship built on mutual respect and shared values. Elphinstone never pushed, never rushed, simply remained a steady presence in her life, offering conversation and companionship without expectation of anything more. 3 years passed. Minerva remained at the ministry, though with growing restlessness. Then, in the winter of 1956, a letter arrived from Hogwarts. It was written in the distinctive script of Albus Dumbledore, who was now deputy headmaster. Professor Tiberius taught Transfiguration and was planning to retire at the end of the academic year. Would Minerva consider applying for the position? She read the letter 3 times, her heart accelerating with each reading. Teaching Transfiguration at Hogwarts. It was everything she had dreamed of during her student years, but had set aside in favor of what she thought was the more responsible path. Dumbledore's letter continued, noting that he had followed her career with interest and believed she possessed not only the knowledge, but the temperament to be an exceptional teacher. Young minds need guidance, he wrote, but they also need examples of integrity and dedication. You embody both, Miss McGonagall, and I believe Hogwarts would be fortunate to have you return. Minerva made her decision within hours. She submitted her resignation to the ministry, wrote her formal application to Hogwarts, and felt a lightness she had not experienced since leaving school. She was going home, not to Caithness, which would always carry memories of Dougal and roads not taken, but to Hogwarts, which had shaped her more profoundly than any other place. The interview process was thorough, but ultimately a formality. Dumbledore had clearly already decided she was the right candidate, and Headmaster Dippet, growing elderly and increasingly reliant on his deputy's judgment, approved the appointment. Minerva would begin teaching in September 1956, at the age of 21, making her one of the youngest professors in Hogwarts history. As she prepared for this new chapter, Elphinstone appeared at her door one evening with a bottle of wine and a quiet smile. "I heard about your new position," he said. "Congratulations. Hogwarts is gaining a remarkable teacher." They sat in her small flat, drinking wine and talking late into the night. And sometime during those hours, Minerva realized that what had begun as friendship had deepened into something more. Not the passionate, aching love she had felt for Dougal, but something gentler and perhaps more sustainable. Affection, respect, companionship, and the comfort of being truly known by another person. When Elphinstone, with characteristic diffidence, suggested that perhaps they might consider a future together once Minerva was settled at Hogwarts, she did not immediately refuse. She asked for time, and he gave it without hesitation. But in her heart, Minerva knew that she had found something precious, a partnership that would not require her to choose between her magical identity and her human heart, a love that accepted all of who she was. She did not marry Elphinstone immediately. First, she needed to establish herself at Hogwarts to prove that she could fulfill the promise Dumbledore saw in her. But the possibility of that future remained, a quiet hope glowing steady as a candle flame in the darkness. And so Minerva McGonagall returned to Hogwarts Castle in the autumn of 1956, carrying with her the wisdom born of loss and the strength forged in grief. She had learned that love was complicated, that duty sometimes demanded sacrifice, and that the choices we make ripple forward in ways we cannot always anticipate. But she had also learned that new beginnings were possible, that purpose could be found even after sorrow, and that sometimes the longest journey leads us back to where we were always meant to be. The castle welcomed her home like a long-lost daughter. When Minerva McGonagall walked through the oak doors of Hogwarts in September 1956, now Professor McGonagall, she felt the ancient stones recognize her, felt the magic that permeated every corridor and tower reach out in greeting. She was 21 years old, carrying her mother's wand and her father's principles, returning to the place that had shaped her more profoundly than anywhere else in the world. But she returned changed, tempered by loss, strengthened by choices made in the crucible of conflicting loyalties. Her quarters were in Gryffindor Tower, near the students she would help shepherd through their years at Hogwarts. The rooms were modest but comfortable, a sitting room with a window overlooking the grounds, a bedroom with a four-poster bed much like the one she had slept in as a student, and a small study lined with bookshelves that she immediately began filling with texts on Transfiguration theory and practice. She hung tartan curtains, a touch of Scotland, and placed a photograph of her parents on her desk, the only truly personal item in otherwise austere surroundings. Albus Dumbledore, now deputy headmaster and still teaching Transfiguration alongside her during her first year, became not just her colleague, but her mentor in the truest sense. He was unlike anyone Minerva had ever known. Brilliant yet humble, powerful yet gentle, capable of both profound wisdom and terrible puns that made her groan despite herself. He saw through her carefully maintained composure to the grief she still carried, but he never pressed, never demanded confidences she was not ready to give. Instead, he taught her through example. Minerva watched how he handled difficult students with patience rather than punishment, how he could be both exacting in his standards and generous in his encouragement. She observed how he balanced authority with accessibility, how he could command a classroom with nothing more than a raised eyebrow, yet make even the most struggling student feel capable of greatness. Teaching, Dumbledore told her during one of their evening conversations in his office, is not merely the transmission of information, Minerva. It is the cultivation of potential. Every student who walks into your classroom carries within them possibilities we cannot yet see. Our task is not to fill empty vessels, but to kindle fires that will burn long after they leave these halls. Minerva took his words to heart. In her classroom, the same room where she had once sat as a student, struggling to transform her first match into a needle, she was demanding, but never cruel, strict, but never unfair. She expected excellence because she believed her students capable of it. She had no patience for laziness or deliberate misbehavior, but she had infinite patience for genuine effort, even when it fell short of success. Her reputation grew quickly. Students learned that Professor McGonagall's classes required intense focus and disciplined practice, but they also learned that she would stay after hours to help anyone who truly wanted to improve. She could reduce a troublemaker to trembling with a single withering look, yet she was the first to defend her students against unjust accusation from any quarter. She was stern as granite and soft as wool, though she showed the softness only to those who needed it most. In 1958, at the end of her second year teaching, Elphinstone Urquhart appeared at Hogwarts on a Saturday in June, when the castle was drowsy with approaching summer and exams were finally finished. He found Minerva in her classroom, organizing teaching materials for the following year, and stood in the doorway watching her work with an expression of such tender admiration that it made her breath catch. "Marry me," he said simply. "I've been patient, and I'll be patient longer if you need it. But I love you, Minerva McGonagall, and I want to spend whatever years we're given as your husband, if you'll have me." Minerva set down the sheaf of parchments she'd been holding. Outside the window, the lake sparkled in the afternoon sun, and somewhere in the distance, students' laughter echoed across the grounds. She looked at Elphinstone, kind, steady Elphinstone, who asked for nothing but offered everything, and made her choice. "Yes," she said. "Yes, I'll marry you." They wed quietly during the summer holiday in the small kirk in Caithness, where her father still preached. It was a simple ceremony, attended by family and a few close friends, blending Muggle and magical traditions in a way that honored both halves of Minerva's heritage. Isabel wept happy tears, and Robert blessed their union with words that spoke of love transcending all divisions. Dumbledore attended, bringing a gift of a silver compass that always pointed toward home, whatever the bearer considered home to be. The marriage was good, built on friendship and mutual respect rather than passionate intensity, and for several years Minerva knew a contentment she had thought lost to her forever. Elphinstone took a position at Hogwarts teaching ancient runes, and they shared quarters in the castle, creating a life of intellectual partnership and quiet domestic happiness. They had no children, a sorrow Minerva carried privately, but they poured their parental instincts into their students, becoming the sort of teachers who shaped lives rather than merely conveying information. But even in these years of relative peace, shadows were gathering in the wizarding world. A young wizard named Tom Riddle, who had been a student at Hogwarts during Minerva's own school years, though she had not known him well, had disappeared from public view after being refused the position of defense against the dark arts teacher. Rumors circulated about dark experiments, about followers gathering, about a philosophy that divided wizards into purebloods and those deemed lesser. Most dismissed these whispers as exaggeration, as the usual paranoia that plagued the magical community in uncertain times. Minerva was not most people. She listened to the reports that filtered through the castle, paid attention when students from certain families began parroting rhetoric about blood purity and magical superiority. She noticed when some of her most promising students, Muggle-born witches and wizards of extraordinary talent, began receiving threatening letters, when accidents that seemed suspicious happened with increasing frequency. She brought her concerns to Dumbledore, who listened with that penetrating attention that suggested he already knew far more than he was saying. "You're right to be worried," he said, finally. Tom Riddle, though he no longer uses that name, preferring to call himself Lord Voldemort, is indeed gathering power. He has become something terrible, something I failed to prevent when I had the chance. We must be watchful, Minerva. Dark times are coming, I fear, and Hogwarts must be a light against that darkness. In 1970, Armando Dippet retired as headmaster, and Albus Dumbledore was appointed to take his place. He offered Minerva the position of deputy headmistress, and though she was young for such responsibility, only 35, she accepted without hesitation. She understood that Dumbledore needed allies he could trust absolutely, that the castle would need strong leadership in the dangerous years ahead. As deputy headmistress, Minerva's influence expanded beyond her classroom. She was responsible for scheduling, for discipline, for the day-to-day operation of the school. She sat on the board of governors, defended Dumbledore's progressive policies against traditional opposition, and worked tirelessly to ensure that Hogwarts remained a safe haven for all students, regardless of blood status. She became the face of authority that students encountered first, stern, unyielding, yet fundamentally fair, while Dumbledore remained the gentler, more distant figure of the headmaster. The First Wizarding War began in earnest in the early 1970s. Lord Voldemort, the name most witches and wizards feared to speak, emerged fully into the open, his Death Eaters attacking Muggle-born families, assassinating prominent opponents, spreading terror through both magical and non-magical communities. The Ministry of Magic proved woefully unprepared for the onslaught, hampered by bureaucracy, infiltration, and the simple disbelief that such evil could exist in their modern, enlightened society. Dumbledore formed the Order of the Phoenix, a secret organization dedicated to fighting Voldemort and his followers. Minerva joined immediately, becoming one of its most trusted members. The work was dangerous and often heartbreaking, rescuing families marked for death, gathering intelligence, confronting Death Eaters, and always trying to stay one step ahead of an enemy who seemed to anticipate their every move. Dear listener, these were dark years that tested Minerva's courage and conviction in ways she had never imagined. She attended the funerals of former students who had joined the Order and paid the ultimate price. She comforted grieving parents whose children had been caught in the crossfire. She maintained the illusion of normalcy at Hogwarts, even as the world outside the castle walls descended into chaos and fear. And then, in the winter of 1985, tragedy struck closer than ever before. Elphinstone, who had also joined the Order despite his gentle nature, was killed by Death Eaters during a mission to protect a Muggle-born family. The attack was swift and brutal. He had apparently tried to shield the family's young daughter and was struck by a killing curse meant for her. He died instantly, heroically, and completely. Minerva received the news in Dumbledore's office. She stood very still as he told her what had happened, his voice gentle but steady, his eyes heavy with sorrow. She did not cry. Not then. Instead, she thanked him for telling her, excused herself with perfect composure, and returned to her quarters. There, she transfigured into her animagus form and remained a cat for 3 days, unable to face her human grief, seeking refuge in the simpler consciousness of her animal self. When she finally transformed back, Dumbledore was sitting in her room waiting patiently. He said nothing, simply offered her a cup of tea and sat with her while she wept for the second husband she had lost, for the future that had been stolen, for the growing certainty that she was meant to walk through this world alone, that everyone she loved would be taken from her in the end. "I cannot lose anyone else," she told Dumbledore through her tears. "I cannot. I won't survive it." "You will," he said gently, "because you must. Because there are students who need you, a castle that needs you, a world that needs what you can give. Grief is the price we pay for love, Minerva. But the love is worth the price, always." After Elphinstone's death, Minerva retreated into her work with an intensity that worried even Dumbledore. She became, if possible, even more strict, even more demanding, even more dedicated to maintaining order and discipline within the castle walls. But those who knew her well could see that beneath the stern exterior, she had become even more protective, even more fiercely devoted to keeping her students safe. Every child who walked through Hogwarts doors became, in some sense, hers to protect, and she would defend them with every ounce of magic and determination she possessed. She remained unmarried thereafter, choosing instead to dedicate herself entirely to Hogwarts and the fight against Voldemort. She lived simply, kept her quarters austere, and found her comfort in routine and purpose rather than personal relationships. She had loved twice and lost twice, and while she would never regret either love, she quietly determined that her heart had given all it could in that regard. The war dragged on through the 1970s and into the 1980s. Minerva taught students who would go on to become heroes: James Potter, Lily Evans, Sirius Black, Remus Lupin, and others of their generation. She watched the Marauders, as they called themselves, grow from mischievous boys into brave young men, though she maintained her stern disapproval of their rule-breaking, even as she privately admired their cleverness and loyalty to one another. She was there on that terrible Halloween night in 1981, when everything changed. Dumbledore came to her in the evening, his face graver than she had ever seen it, and told her that Lily and James Potter were dead, murdered by Voldemort himself. But their infant son, Harry, had survived, and more than survived, had somehow destroyed Voldemort in the process, reducing the Dark Lord to something less than spirit, though not quite dead. "We must take the boy to his mother's relatives," Dumbledore said. "The blood protection Lily gave him when she died will keep him safe there, safer than anywhere in the wizarding world." Minerva argued against this decision with all the force of her conviction. The Dursleys were the worst sort of muggles, narrow-minded, materialistic, actively hostile to anything unusual. She had watched them during the days when she'd been sent to observe them, had seen how they lived, and knew in her bones that Harry Potter would not be raised with love in that house. "You're asking us to leave him on a doorstep like a bottle of milk," she protested. "These people will never understand him, never love him as he deserves. He's famous, Albus. Every child in our world will know his name. He could grow up twisted by it, ruined by either neglect or hero worship gone wrong." But Dumbledore was adamant, and in the end, Minerva bowed to his judgment, though it cost her dearly. She waited on Privet Drive in her animagus form all day, watching the perfectly ordinary street with its perfectly ordinary houses, her heart heavy with misgiving. When Dumbledore finally arrived with baby Harry in Hagrid's arms, she transformed back to human form and made one last plea. "Please reconsider. This is a mistake." "Perhaps," Dumbledore acknowledged, "but it is a mistake I must make, for reasons I cannot fully explain even to you, my dear friend. Trust me in this, Minerva. Harry Potter will be safer here than anywhere else, and one day, when the time is right, he will return to our world. Until then, we must let him have what childhood he can, away from fame and expectation." They placed the sleeping child on the doorstep with a letter of explanation, and Minerva watched through tears as Dumbledore used the deluminator to restore the streetlights, and they departed, leaving Harry Potter to a fate she feared would be unkind. It was one of the hardest things she had ever done, and for years afterward, she would wonder if they had made the right choice, if protecting Harry from dark wizards was worth condemning him to neglect and misunderstanding. But the war was over. Voldemort was gone, if not truly dead. The Death Eaters were being rounded up, tried, and imprisoned. The wizarding world began the slow process of healing, of rebuilding, of trying to reclaim the innocence that had been lost. And Minerva McGonagall remained at Hogwarts, teaching Transfiguration, serving as deputy headmistress, and carrying in her heart the names and faces of all those who had been lost, students, colleagues, friends, and 2 husbands who had deserved longer, happier lives than fate had granted them. She was harder now, the softness buried so deep that only those who knew where to look could find it. But it was there still, in the way she stayed late to help a struggling student, in the fierce protection she offered to those in her care, in the unwavering loyalty she gave to Dumbledore and the ideals they both served. She was steel wrapped in stern robes and sharp words, but beneath it all, she remained capable of profound gentleness for those who truly needed it. The years between the wars passed with a strange quality, peaceful on the surface, yet never quite settled, like a lake that appears calm but conceals dangerous currents beneath. Minerva McGonagall continued her work at Hogwarts with the same dedication she had always shown, teaching Transfiguration to generations of students, serving as deputy headmistress with unwavering efficiency and maintaining the standards of excellence that had become her hallmark. But there was a watchfulness to her now, a vigilance that never quite relaxed, as though some part of her remained always alert for the darkness to return. And then, in the summer of 1991, Harry Potter came to Hogwarts. Minerva had thought about him often over the years, the boy she had left on a doorstep, the child who carried the weight of such loss and such legend. When his name emerged from the Goblet of Fire, no, forgive me, dear listener, I'm getting ahead of myself. Let us begin at the proper beginning, with Harry's first year, when everything started to shift and change once more. She was there on that September evening when Harry arrived for his sorting, and her heart clenched at the sight of him. He was small for his age, wearing glasses that were held together with tape, his robes slightly too large, his hair an untamable mess that reminded her painfully of James Potter. But it was his eyes, Lily's eyes, that brilliant green, that struck her most profoundly. In those eyes, she saw confusion, wonder, and a kind of watchful wariness that no child should have to carry. The sorting hat deliberated over Harry Potter longer than usual, and Minerva found herself holding her breath. When the hat finally shouted, "Gryffindor!" she felt relief flood through her. He would be in her house, where she could watch over him, protect him as she had been unable to do all those years ago. She applauded with the rest of Gryffindor table, but her eyes remained fixed on the boy, cataloguing everything. The way he moved, the uncertainty in his expression, the small smile that emerged when his new housemates welcomed him. That first year brought challenges Minerva could not have anticipated. Harry and his friends, Ron Weasley and Hermione Granger, both of whom she recognized immediately as exceptional students in their own ways, seemed to attract trouble, like magnets attract iron. Yet beneath the rule-breaking and the near disasters, she saw courage and loyalty and a determination to do what was right that reminded her powerfully of James and Lily and their generation. when Harry and Ron flew a car to Hogwarts in their second year, crashing into the Whomping Willow with spectacular destructiveness. Minerva's fury was genuine, but so was her relief that they had survived. When she assigned them detention, she saw Harry accept the punishment without complaint, understanding that actions had consequences, and she felt a fierce pride that the boy was growing into someone worthy of his parents' sacrifice. But it was during Harry's third year that everything became more complicated. Sirius Black escaped from Azkaban, and suddenly Minerva found herself confronting memories she had tried to bury, memories of a brilliant, troubled boy who had been one of her students, who had been James Potter's best friend, who had allegedly betrayed everything they all fought for. The idea that Sirius might come to Hogwarts seeking Harry filled her with protective fury. She doubled her vigilance, patrolling corridors at night in her animagus form, watching for any sign of intrusion. When Dementors were stationed around the school, those terrible creatures that fed on happiness and hope, she protested vigorously to the Ministry, though her objections were overruled. She watched Harry struggle with the Dementors' effects more than other students, saw how they pulled him into memories of loss, and understood that trauma lived in the body long after the mind tried to move past it. The truth about Sirius Black, when it finally emerged, left Minerva shaken. He had been innocent all along, framed by Peter Pettigrew, suffering 12 years in Azkaban for crimes he hadn't committed. She had believed the worst of him, as had everyone else, and the realization of that injustice sat heavy on her conscience. When Sirius escaped again, this time from Hogwarts itself, with Dumbledore's apparent blessing, Minerva said nothing, understanding that sometimes justice existed outside the boundaries of law. Then came Harry's fourth year, and the Triwizard Tournament that should never have included him. Minerva fought against Harry's participation with every argument she could muster, but the magical contract bound him regardless. She watched, helpless and furious, as a 14-year-old boy was forced into deadly challenges meant for students years older and far more experienced. The night Harry returned from the graveyard, carrying Cedric Diggory's body and babbling about Voldemort's return, Minerva's world tilted on its axis. She had hoped desperately, foolishly, that Voldemort was gone forever, that the peace would last, that this generation of students would not have to face the darkness their parents had fought. But hope, she was learning, was often a luxury the world could not afford. Dumbledore believed Harry immediately, and so did Minerva, though it meant accepting that everything was about to change once more. The Ministry, under Cornelius Fudge's increasingly paranoid leadership, refused to acknowledge Voldemort's return, instead launching a smear campaign against both Harry and Dumbledore. It was a political nightmare, and Minerva found herself in the uncomfortable position of defending her headmaster and her student against attacks from the very institution that was supposed to protect the wizarding world. The following year brought Dolores Umbridge to Hogwarts, and dear listener, if Minerva had faced challenges before, they were nothing compared to the trial of that woman's presence. Umbridge arrived as Defense Against the Dark Arts teacher, appointed by the Ministry, wrapped in pink cardigans and false sweetness, wielding bureaucratic power like a weapon. She was everything Minerva despised, cruel masquerading as kind, authoritarian masquerading as orderly, small-minded and vindictive, and utterly convinced of her own righteousness. Minerva clashed with Umbridge from the first day. When Umbridge interrupted her during the start of term feast, Minerva's expression could have frozen fire. When Umbridge began issuing educational decrees that undermined Dumbledore's authority and restricted students' freedoms, Minerva opposed her at every turn, though always within the letter of the law. She would not give Umbridge the satisfaction of catching her in open rebellion. She watched Umbridge torture Harry with that terrible quill, saw the scars it left on his hand, and felt a rage so profound it frightened her. But Dumbledore counseled patience, warned her that open confrontation would only make things worse, and so Minerva channeled her fury into quiet resistance, helping students in ways Umbridge couldn't quite prove, maintaining standards of excellence that stood in stark contrast to Umbridge's deteriorating curriculum. When Umbridge was appointed a High Inquisitor and began evaluating teachers, Minerva endured the humiliation with icy dignity. She taught her lesson with Umbridge watching, clipboard in hand, and received a satisfactory rating delivered with barely concealed disappointment. But Minerva had been teaching for nearly 50 years by then. She knew her worth, and no bureaucrat with delusions of grandeur could diminish it. The night Umbridge sent Dementors after Harry, an illegal act of such profound recklessness that it defied comprehension, Minerva wanted to march to the Ministry and hex every official in sight. Instead, she stood with Dumbledore and fought to keep Harry at Hogwarts, testified at his hearing, and felt vindicated when he was cleared of all charges. But the victory was short-lived. Umbridge's power grew throughout that terrible year, until finally she was appointed headmistress after Dumbledore was forced to flee. Minerva found herself deputy headmistress under a woman she loathed, forced to watch Umbridge dismantle everything Hogwarts stood for. Yet she remained, because abandoning the students to Umbridge's mercies was unthinkable. The night Umbridge tried to use Veritaserum on Harry, then threatened to use the Cruciatus curse, an unforgivable, illegal under any circumstances, Minerva intervened with such fierce authority that even Umbridge hesitated. "I will not have you torturing students in this castle," Minerva said, her voice cutting like a blade, and for a moment she thought Umbridge might actually back down. But Umbridge was beyond reason, and only Hermione's quick thinking, luring Umbridge into the Forbidden Forest where the centaurs dealt with her, saved Harry from that particular horror. When Umbridge returned to the castle, traumatized and babbling, Minerva felt not sympathy, but grim satisfaction. Sometimes justice came from unexpected sources. Then came the night that changed everything. Minerva was patrolling the corridors when she heard footsteps running. Harry Potter and several others, clearly on some urgent mission. Before she could stop them, Death Eaters appeared in the castle itself, summoned by Draco Malfoy through the Vanishing Cabinet. The Battle of the Astronomy Tower had begun. Minerva fought with a ferocity that surprised even herself. Her transfiguration skills turned to combat, her every spell precise and devastating. She was not young anymore, nearly 70, but she fought like a woman half her age, protecting students, driving back Death Eaters, her McGonagall tartan robes swirling around her like a battle standard. Then she saw Dumbledore fall from the tower, saw his body plummet, and even from a distance she knew. Her mentor, her friend, the man who had shaped so much of who she had become, gone, murdered by Severus Snape, a man Dumbledore had trusted absolutely. The grief that swept through Minerva was unlike anything she had experienced before. She had lost husbands, friends, students. But Dumbledore's death felt like the collapse of a foundation she hadn't realized she was standing on. He had been the constant in her adult life, the steady presence she relied on even when they disagreed, the one person whose judgment she trusted without reservation. At his funeral, Minerva sat rigid with grief, listening to eulogies that could not possibly capture the enormity of what had been lost. She did not cry. She had learned long ago to keep her tears private. But her hands trembled in her lap, and her heart felt like a stone in her chest. Afterward, when the ministry offered her the position of headmistress, she accepted without hesitation. Hogwarts needed leadership, needed someone who understood what Dumbledore had been trying to do, who would continue his work even in his absence. But she knew, taking on the role, that she was stepping into an impossible situation. Voldemort's forces were growing stronger, the ministry was compromised, and the darkness was closing in from all sides. The following year, Harry's 7th year, though he did not attend, was the worst of Minerva's long life. The ministry fell to Voldemort's control, and the Death Eaters took over Hogwarts, installing Severus Snape as headmaster with the Carrows as his enforcers. Minerva was forced to watch as everything she and Dumbledore had built was corrupted, as students were punished with dark curses, as Muggleborns were hunted, and fear became the dominant emotion in the castle's ancient halls. But Minerva did not break. She protected students however she could, provided alibis, healed injuries that officially never happened, and maintained a core of resistance within the castle walls. She was watched constantly, suspected of disloyalty, yet she played her part perfectly. The stern teacher concerned only with discipline and tradition, no threat to the new regime. Then, on that night in May 1998, Harry Potter returned to Hogwarts. Minerva was alerted by the caterwauling charm, went to investigate, and found Harry in the Ravenclaw common room with Luna Lovegood. The surge of relief and determination she felt seeing him was overwhelming. When the Carrows arrived, Minerva acted without hesitation. She dueled them, stunning one and driving the other back. And when Snape appeared, she faced him with all the fury she had been suppressing for months. Their duel shook the castle. Minerva's transfiguration against Snape's dark arts, steel against shadow, loyalty against betrayal. She drove him from the castle, and though she did not know then the truth about his ultimate allegiance, the satisfaction of defeating Dumbledore's murderer, was fierce and sweet. Then came the preparation for battle. Voldemort was coming, his army with him, and Hogwarts would make its stand. Minerva organized the defense with military precision, evacuating younger students, preparing older ones to fight, rallying the teachers, and enlisting the castle's magic itself. She stood on the ramparts and brought the castle to life. "Pier totum locomotor," she cried, and all throughout Hogwarts, suits of armor sprang into motion, drawing weapons, marching to defend their home. The stone soldiers of Hogwarts responded to her call, and Minerva allowed herself one moment of fierce joy at the magic of it, at the sight of an entire castle rising to fight. "I've always wanted to use that spell," she told Molly Weasley with the ghost of a smile. And for just a moment, the weight of years and sorrow lifted, and she was simply a witch, doing what needed to be done. The Battle of Hogwarts was chaos and terror and heroism beyond measure. Minerva fought through it all, her spells never faltering, her courage never failing. She dueled Death Eaters, protected students, saw friends and colleagues fall, and kept fighting because stopping was not an option. When she saw Hagrid carrying what appeared to be Harry's dead body, she screamed, a sound of such anguish that it cut through the battle's noise. But even then, she did not surrender. And then Harry revealed himself alive, and the final confrontation between him and Voldemort began. Minerva stood with Kingsley Shacklebolt and Horace Slughorn, the three of them dueling Voldemort together, matching the Dark Lord's power with their combined skill. It was not enough to defeat him. That would be Harry's task. But they held him, prevented him from killing others, bought precious time for the final act of this long, terrible war. When Voldemort fell, when his body hit the ground with a dull finality that meant it was truly over, Minerva felt her knees weaken. She remained standing through sheer force of will. But everything inside her wanted to collapse, to weep, to sleep for 100 years. They had won, but the cost, the cost had been terrible. Fred Weasley, Remus Lupin, Nymphadora Tonks, Colin Creevey, Lavender Brown, and so many others. The Great Hall became a place of mourning even in victory. But Hogwarts still stood, damaged, scarred, filled with grief, but standing. And Minerva McGonagall, head mistress of Hogwarts, survivor of 2 wars, stood with it, ready to begin the work of rebuilding, of healing, of ensuring that those who had died would not be forgotten, and that their sacrifice would mean something lasting. The dawn after the Battle of Hogwarts broke soft and golden over the castle, painting the damaged stones in warm light that seemed impossibly gentle after so much darkness. Minerva McGonagall stood at a shadowed window in the headmistress's office. Dumbledore's office, she still thought of it, though it was hers now, and watched the sun rise over grounds littered with debris and sorrow. She had not slept. She was not certain she would ever sleep properly again, haunted as she would be by the faces of those who had fallen, by the children who had fought when they should have been safe, by the weight of survival when so many had not survived. But Hogwarts still stood, and where the castle stood, there was work to be done. The first weeks after the battle passed in a blur of activity that left no time for grief, though grief waited patiently in every corner, ready to ambush her in quiet moments. There were bodies to be laid to rest with proper ceremony and honor. There were families to notify, to comfort, to stand with as they buried their children, their siblings, their parents. Minerva attended every funeral she could. Her presence, a silent promise that those who had died would not be forgotten, that their sacrifice would be remembered and honored. There were also the practicalities of restoration. The castle had been damaged extensively. Walls blasted apart, corridors collapsed, entire sections rendered unsafe. Minerva coordinated with the ministry, with private donors, with anyone who would help to begin the repairs. She walked through the castle daily, her wand moving in precise patterns as she supervised the reconstruction, insisting that everything be restored properly, that shortcuts would not be tolerated, that Hogwarts deserved to be made whole again. She was 73 years old, and she felt every year of it in her bones. The battle had taken its toll. She had been struck by several curses, had pushed herself beyond reasonable limits, had drawn on reserves of magic and strength that left her depleted in ways that worried the few people she allowed close enough to notice. Poppy Pomfrey, the school matron, had ordered her to rest, to let others handle the immediate crisis. But Minerva could not. If she stopped, if she allowed herself to feel the full weight of everything that had happened, she feared she might never move again. So she worked, and in working, she began to heal. The decision about whether to reopen Hogwarts came swiftly. Some argued that the school should remain closed for a full year, that students and staff needed time to recover, that the castle itself needed more extensive repairs before it could safely house hundreds of young witches and wizards. But Minerva fought fiercely against this proposal. Hogwarts needed to reopen as soon as possible, needed to demonstrate that evil had not won, that the light endured, that education and hope and the future would not be held hostage to fear. These children have lost enough, she told the Board of Governors, her voice brooking no argument. They have lost friends, family members, years of their childhood to war and fear. What they need now is normalcy, structure, a place where they can learn and grow and remember how to hope again. Hogwarts can provide that, and we have a duty to do so. The board, faced with Minerva McGonagall at her most formidable, approved the reopening for September 1998. It would be a transitional year, with special accommodations for students who had missed their education during the previous year's chaos, with additional counselors available for those struggling with trauma, with modified expectations that recognized what everyone had been through. But the school would open, and Minerva would be there to welcome students home. That summer, she worked tirelessly on the preparations. She hired new teachers to replace those who had died or could no longer continue, including a new defense against the dark arts teacher, though she insisted on rigorous background checks and trial periods, determined never again to allow that position to become a source of danger. She met with every returning staff member individually, assessing their readiness to continue, offering support where needed, making difficult decisions when someone could not go on. She also spent hours in the Room of Requirement, which had been destroyed during the battle, when Crabbe's fiendfire had raged out of control. The room that had served so many purposes over the centuries, that had sheltered Dumbledore's army and hidden countless secrets, was gone. Minerva mourned its loss as she might mourn a person, understanding that some things, once destroyed, could not be restored, but other spaces could be reclaimed and repurposed. She established a memorial garden on the grounds, where a monument would stand inscribed with the names of all who had died in the battle. She commissioned portraits of fallen teachers to hang in places of honor throughout the castle. She created a new tradition. Every year on the anniversary of the battle, classes would be suspended for a day of remembrance, ensuring that future generations would never forget the price of the peace they inherited. When September first arrived, Minerva stood once more at the entrance of the Great Hall, watching students file in for the start of term feast. Many faces were missing, some dead, others so traumatized they could not return, still others who had graduated or chosen different paths. But new faces appeared as well, younger students who had been kept away during Voldemort's reign, now finally able to attend the school their parents and grandparents had loved. Harry Potter was not among the returning students. He had decided not to complete his 7th year, having already lived more than most people experienced in a lifetime. Minerva understood, though part of her wished she could have taught him one more year, could have seen him simply be a student, free from the burden of being the chosen one. But Harry had earned the right to choose his own path, and she would not begrudge him that freedom. Ron Weasley and Hermione Granger did return, however, determined to complete their education properly. Minerva was glad to have them, though she maintained her usual stern demeanor in their presence. When Hermione achieved perfect marks in every subject by the end of the year, Minerva permitted herself a small smile of pride. When Ron showed unexpected leadership in rallying younger students during a crisis, Minerva noted it approvingly in his file. They had both grown far beyond their years, and she was honored to have played some small part in shaping who they had become. The rebuilding of Hogwarts took several years, and not all of it was physical. The castle stones could be repaired with magic and effort, but healing the psychological wounds left by war was slower and more uncertain work. Minerva established support systems, hired specialists in trauma, created spaces where students could speak freely about their experiences without judgment. She learned to recognize the signs of someone struggling, the sudden withdrawal, the hypervigilance, the nightmares that left students exhausted and afraid, and she intervened with a gentleness that surprised those who knew her only as the stern professor. Dear listener, in these years after the war, Minerva McGonagall revealed depths of compassion that had always existed but had been hidden beneath layers of duty and discipline. She had learned through her own losses how grief could shatter a person, how trauma lived in the body long after the mind tried to move forward, and she used that hard-won wisdom to help others navigate their own healing journeys. She also worked to reform magical education more broadly. The war had exposed weaknesses in how the wizarding world prepared young witches and wizards for life beyond school. Too much emphasis on rote learning, not enough on critical thinking. Too much separation between pure-blood and muggle-born students. Not enough integration that might have prevented the prejudices that fed Voldemort's ideology. Too little attention to the ethical dimensions of magic, to the responsibilities that came with power. Minerva introduced changes gradually, knowing that pushing too hard too fast would generate resistance. She expanded the curriculum to include Muggle studies as a core subject rather than an elective, arguing that magical Britain could no longer afford to remain ignorant of the non-magical world that surrounded and outnumbered them. She brought in guest speakers, including Hermione Granger, who had become a brilliant advocate for house elf and magical creature rights, to discuss real-world applications of magic and ethics. She also addressed the house system, which had been exploited during the war, to divide students along ideological lines. She could not eliminate the houses. They were too fundamental to Hogwarts' identity. But she introduced more inter-house cooperation, more shared activities that required students from different houses to work together toward common goals. She wanted to preserve house pride while eliminating house prejudice, a delicate balance that required constant attention and adjustment. Through all of this, Minerva remained a formidable presence in the castle. Students still straightened their robes when they saw her approaching, still whispered nervously before being called to her office, still worked harder in Transfiguration than in almost any other subject. because disappointing Professor McGonagall seemed like a fate worse than failing. But they also knew in ways that transcended words that she cared for them deeply, that beneath the stern exterior lived a fierce protectiveness that would move mountains to keep them safe. She taught for another decade after the war, and in that time, she shaped hundreds more young minds. Some of her former students became professors themselves, returning to Hogwarts to teach new generations. Others went on to transform the ministry, to revolutionize magical medicine, to bridge the divide between magical and non-magical communities, to create art and music and literature that enriched wizarding culture. And when they achieved these things, many of them wrote to Professor McGonagall, thanking her for the foundation she had given them, for believing in them when they doubted themselves, for teaching them that excellence was not about perfection, but about persistent, disciplined effort toward worthy goals. Minerva kept these letters in a special drawer in her desk, and on difficult days, she would read through them and remember why she had devoted her life to teaching, why all the sacrifices and sorrows had been worth it. She never remarried after Elphinstone's death, never even entertained the possibility. Her life was full in other ways, full of students who needed her, full of a castle that was her truest home, full of purpose that sustained her through the loneliness. She had her colleagues, particularly Pomona Sprout and Phileas Flitwick, who had become dear friends over the decades. She had her animagus form, which she still used regularly, prowling the castle at night as a tabby cat, finding peace in that simpler existence. And she had her memories of Dougal and Elphinstone, of Dumbledore's wisdom and Hagrid's loyalty, of students who had become heroes, of battles fought and won at terrible cost, of ordinary moments in classrooms where magic happened not in spells, but in the light of understanding dawning in a young person's eyes. When Minerva finally decided to retire at the age of 83, it was not because she felt unable to continue, but because she recognized that Hogwarts needed new leadership for a new era. The world was changing rapidly, and while she had adapted as much as anyone of her generation could, she understood that fresh perspectives and younger energy would serve the school better than her continued tenure. She chose her successor carefully, a brilliant former student who shared her values and her dedication, but brought innovative ideas about magical education that excited Minerva, even as they made her realize how much the world had moved beyond her direct experience. The transition was smooth, marked by ceremony and celebration that Minerva endured with characteristic dignity while secretly counting the moments until she could escape the fuss and attention. In retirement, Minerva did not leave Hogwarts. The castle was her home, and she could no more abandon it than she could stop breathing. She kept a small suite of rooms in Gryffindor Tower, where she could look out over the grounds she loved and listen to the sounds of student life continuing without her direct involvement. She spent her days reading, corresponding with former students, occasionally guest lecturing when the current Transfiguration professor requested her expertise, and taking long walks around the grounds in both human and feline form. She was often seen in the memorial garden, sitting on a bench among the flowering plants, her gnarled hands resting on her walking stick, her eyes distant with memory. Students would sometimes find her there and approach shyly, asking questions about the war or about their parents and grandparents who had been her students. Minerva always made time for these conversations, understanding that she had become a living link to history, a repository of stories that needed to be passed down. On warm summer evenings, she would transform into her tabby form and climb to the highest tower of the castle, where she would sit and watch the sunset over the forbidden forest, over the lake that reflected the sky like a mirror, over the distant mountains that had watched over Hogwarts for 1,000 years. In those moments, she felt the full span of her life. The girl from Caithness, who had first seen the castle from a boat on the lake, the young teacher nervous about her first class, the war-hardened professor who had fought for every student under her care. And now, this, an old woman at peace with her choices, content with her legacy, ready for whatever came next. Dear listener, Minerva McGonagall lived to the remarkable age of 91, remaining sharp and engaged until nearly the very end. When her health finally began to fail, she faced it with the same courage and dignity she had brought to every other challenge in her life. She refused to be moved to St. Mungo's Hospital, insisting that she would die in Hogwarts if die she must, in the castle that had been more truly her home than anywhere else in the world. Poppy Pomfrey, herself elderly now, but still capable, tended to her with gentle efficiency. Former students visited in a steady stream. Harry Potter and Ron Weasley and Hermione Granger, now middle-aged and accomplished. Neville Longbottom, who had become Hogwarts herbology professor. Dozens of others whose lives she had touched. She received them all, sometimes too weak to speak much, but always conveying with her eyes and her slight smiles that she was glad to see them, that she was proud of who they had become. On a quiet morning in early autumn, when the castle was just waking and the grounds were painted in shades of gold and amber, Minerva McGonagall passed peacefully in her sleep. The castle itself seemed to mourn. Portraits wept openly, ghosts drifted through corridors with unusual solemnity, and even the suits of armor that she had brought to life during the battle seemed to stand at slightly more rigid attention, as though offering a final salute. Her funeral was attended by what seemed like the entire wizarding world of Britain and beyond. Ministers of magic, former students, colleagues spanning decades, even representatives from other magical schools came to pay their respects. The ceremony was held in the Great Hall, which was filled to capacity and beyond, with mourners spilling out into the corridors. The service was simple and dignified, exactly as she would have wanted, with readings from her favorite texts on Transfiguration theory, with testimonials from those whose lives she had shaped, with music that honored both her Scottish heritage and her Hogwarts identity. They buried her in the memorial garden she had created, among the flowers and beneath a stone that bore her name and the dates of her long life and a simple inscription. She taught us to be brave. It was not comprehensive. It could not possibly capture everything she had been, but it was true, and truth had always mattered more to Minerva McGonagall than elaborate praise. But death, dear listener, is not quite the end for those who teach at Hogwarts. A portrait of Minerva McGonagall appeared in the headmistress's office, taking its place among the other former heads of school. The painted Minerva was perhaps slightly younger than she had been at the end, her hair more dark than grey, her face less lined, but her expression was unmistakable, that particular combination of sternness and subtle warmth that had defined her throughout her life. From her frame, Portrait Minerva could observe the continuing life of the school, could offer advice to future headmasters and headmistresses, could ensure that the values she had fought for would not be forgotten. She took her responsibilities seriously, as she had taken everything seriously in life, occasionally making tartly worded comments when she felt current leadership was making poor decisions, but generally maintaining a dignified silence punctuated by occasional dry observations that reminded everyone that Minerva McGonagall, even in painted form, remained a force to be reckoned with. Students walking through the castle would sometimes catch glimpses of a silver tabby cat with distinctive square markings around its eyes, prowling corridors or sitting in patches of sunlight. Some dismissed these sightings as ordinary cats that had wandered into the castle. Others, more romantically inclined, whispered that it was Professor McGonagall's spirit, still watching over Hogwarts, still protecting the students she had devoted her life to serving. Whether ghost or legend, or simply the collective memory of generations giving form to their love, the tabby cat sightings continued year after year, a gentle reminder that some presences never truly leave the places they loved. In classrooms, Minerva's name was invoked by teachers trying to inspire excellence. Professor McGonagall would not have accepted such sloppy wand work, or remember what Professor McGonagall used to say about precision in Transfiguration. In the Gryffindor common room, first years were regaled with stories about the legendary strictness of Professor McGonagall, about her impossibly high standards, about the terror and pride of receiving one of her rare compliments. But those who had actually known her, who had been her students or colleagues or friends, spoke of different things. They spoke of her loyalty, unwavering and absolute to those who earned it. They spoke of her courage, which had carried her through 2 wars and countless personal losses without ever surrendering to despair. They spoke of her integrity, which had made her incapable of compromise when principles were at stake, yet flexible and compassionate when rigidity would have caused unnecessary harm. They spoke of her love, hidden beneath layers of dignity and propriety, but blazing fierce and true for those under her care. The legacy of Minerva McGonagall lived on in the countless students she had taught, who in turn taught their own children and students, creating ripples that spread outward through generations. It lived on in the reforms she had implemented, in the more inclusive and ethically grounded magical education that had emerged from the ashes of war. It lived on in the memorial garden and the anniversary observances that kept alive the memory of those who had fought and died. It lived on in the very stones of Hogwarts, which had been defended and rebuilt and loved by this remarkable witch who had given everything to ensure that the castle would endure as a beacon of light in a world that too often turned toward darkness. And perhaps most importantly, her legacy lived on in the simple but profound example of a life lived with purpose and principle. Minerva McGonagall had shown that it was possible to be both strong and kind, both demanding and compassionate, both uncompromising in one's values and flexible in one's approach. She had demonstrated that teaching was not merely a profession but a calling, that protecting the vulnerable was worth any personal sacrifice, that loyalty and courage and love were not weaknesses but the greatest strengths a person could possess. Years turned to decades, and decades to generations, but the name Minerva McGonagall never faded from Hogwarts' collective memory. Students who had never known her in life learned her story and felt inspired by it. Teachers invoked her example when they needed courage to make difficult decisions. The portrait in the headmistress's office continued to offer occasional wisdom, ensuring that her voice, crisp, clear, and utterly uncompromising when it came to doing what was right, continued to echo through the castle's ancient halls. On quiet evenings, when the castle settled into peaceful silence and moonlight streamed through the high windows, some swore they could hear the soft sound of a cat purring, contentment radiating from the very stones, and perhaps in some way that transcended ordinary understanding, Minerva McGonagall remained present in the place she had loved most, her spirit woven into the magic that made Hogwarts what it was. A school, yes, but also a home, a sanctuary, a place where young witches and wizards learned not just spells and potions, but how to be brave, how to be kind, how to stand firm in the face of darkness and choose light even when the cost was high. This, dear listener, was the life of Minerva McGonagall, born in the Scottish Highlands to a witch and a minister, shaped by love and loss, tempered by war and grief, devoted entirely to the education and protection of the young, remembered always as the finest teacher Hogwarts had known in generations. Her story, like all our stories, was one of choices made and paths taken, of joys celebrated and sorrows endured, of a life lived with intention and integrity from beginning to end. Now, dear listener, as this long tale draws to its close, let yourself drift into the peaceful darkness of sleep. Let the memory of Minerva McGonagall's courage and compassion wrap around you like a warm cloak. Let the image of Hogwarts Castle, eternal and enduring, be the last thing you see as your eyes close. Let the soft purr of a tabby cat, content in the home it loves, be the last sound you hear as consciousness fades. You are safe, dear listener. You are protected, as all of Minerva's students were protected. You are valued, as all who knew her were valued. And as you sleep, may you dream of magic and moonlight, of ancient castles and steadfast loyalty, of lives lived with purpose and legacies that echo through time. Sleep well, dear listener, under the watch of the Linus. Sleep deeply, knowing that courage and love endure beyond any single lifetime. Sleep peacefully, cradled by the story of a remarkable woman who showed us all what it means to live with grace and die with dignity, leaving the world better than she found it. Good night, dear listener. Rest in the legacy of Professor Minerva McGonagall, and may her example light your way through whatever darkness you may face in the days to come. The story is told, dear listener. The life has been lived, the battles fought, the students taught, the legacy secured. Minerva McGonagall's journey from a girl in the Scottish Highlands to the greatest witch of her age is complete. And in its completion, we find not an ending, but a continuing presence, a spirit that will never truly fade from the world she served so well. As you drift now into the deepest sleep, imagine yourself walking through Hogwarts one final time. The corridors are quiet, lit by torches that cast dancing shadows on ancient stone. Portraits murmur softly in their frames, exchanging gossip and wisdom in equal measure. Somewhere in the distance, you hear the faint echo of students laughing, of life continuing as it always has and always will in this magical place. You climb the moving staircases. They are gentle with you, leading you exactly where you need to go, and emerge into the moonlit grounds. The lake spreads before you like a mirror, reflecting stars and castle in perfect symmetry. The forbidden forest stands dark but no longer threatening, its mysteries held in respectful silence. The memorial garden glows with soft magical light, each flower a small beacon of remembrance. And there, on a bench beneath the ancient trees, you see a silver tabby cat with distinctive square markings around its eyes. The cat looks at you with knowing amber eyes, purrs once in greeting, and then transforms, just for a moment, just for you, into the figure of Professor McGonagall herself, younger and at peace, smiling with that rare warmth she reserved for those she trusted. "Well done," she says softly. "You have listened well. Now rest, and let your dreams be gentle." She transforms back into a cat, leaps down from the bench, and pads away into the moonlight, disappearing among the shadows, but never truly gone. You feel yourself settling into the deepest, most restful sleep, wrapped in the protection of Hogwarts, blessed by the memory of the lioness, safe in the knowledge that some spirits watch over us, even when we cannot see them. The castle breathes around you. The stars wheel overhead in their eternal dance. Magic hums in the earth and air and water, constant and comforting. And you sleep, dear listener. You sleep and dream of courage and loyalty, of stern professors with soft hearts, of lives lived with purpose and remembered with love. Sleep now. Sleep deeply. Sleep peacefully. The story is complete, and you are home. Good night.